Hello, my name is Joe van Wyk and welcome to my channel. You're watching Screenplay Essentials and this is episode 1 part 2 in which I'll be talking about the protagonist as your main character. Continuing from part 1 where we spoke about the main character that is separated from your protagonist, you view the story through the eyes of the main character, and through the process of objective writing you create main characters that their collective experiences build the narrative of the story. Whatever experiences they have of the conflict, that is the story that they tell. They may not be proactively or protagonist per se. But in this episode we'll be talking about the main character as the protagonist, and if you're a subjective writer myself, you'll definitely benefit from this episode and the next. As a default setting or a general rule of thumb is that you should always aim for a proactive protagonist, because it's one that closely connects with the audience and you hook the audience by this obsession of the main character trying to proactively move the plot forward and try to obtain their super objective. The only exception to the rule is if you're an objective writer and you create these main characters that tell the story differently through their perspectives, different perspectives, or their experiences that they have about the conflict. But in this part 2, we'll be talking about the various types of protagonists that you find as your main character. And in part 3, I'll be talking about some writing tips that can help you create an effective protagonist. Originally, I had both of them together in one episode, but it took quite a long duration, so I decided to split it in half. And this episode will be only focused on the types of protagonists that you find, and the third one will be just some tips to help you create an effective protagonist in your own unique story, your own unique premise that you're building, or creating your own unique protagonist. So first of all, the classical definition of a protagonist. It comes all the way from Greek drama, the term protagonistes. I'm probably butchering the Greek pronunciation, but essentially means the player of the first part, or the chief actor, or the character that the player that suffers first. And this type of protagonist, main character, is one that the entire narrative and plot revolves around. It's usually what the story is about this protagonist. It's the chief character that the audience identifies with, support with, roots for, empathize with, share their emotion with. Essentially because you are putting the audience into the eyes of the main character, the protagonist, and you take them on the journey in which they proactively move the story forward, trying to achieve their super objective or the desires that compel them. It's very important to make them obsessive, as I've discussed in the previous series, because it's a very clever way to hook your audience. When you focus your protagonist, you focus your audience attention. The protagonist proactively shapes the narrative around them. The external plot takes on many different forms, especially when you involve the character arcs that shapes them, and they are 100% involved in the central conflict, the world problem that they're trying to solve, the crisis of that story. It's very important that they are involved 100% and that they don't shy away from that conflict, that they are trying to solve that crisis in whichever way. They're usually required to be in the opening scene or in various forms that opening scenes can come in. They're required to tell their story in the ordinary world and how you slowly build up with the audience on their journey. And they're required to participate in the inciting incident that propels them into the extraordinary world of Act 2, and with all the trials and triumphs and trials that they undertake. And then they're required to finalize the story in Act 3, whichever way possible, how they learned or changed or grew or declined or suffered some sort of tragedy. And they're required to be in the climax scene with the antagonist or the opposing force, solving their conflict in whichever way and finalizing the story, whether it's a happy ending or a sad ending. But they are 100% involved in their conflict and their forward momentum, proactively moving the plot forward towards a super objective. Their meaning exceeds the general concept of being a lead character in the story. They often represent themes and struggles and emotions, empathy. They represent things that resonate with the audience and how they take the audience on a journey. Is very, very important in writing any type of story, is that you take your audience on a journey. Lastly, a protagonist can also believe a lie that shapes their view, their viewpoint of, and how they see the world. And this symptoms of the lie can shape their forward momentum in how they try to obtain what they desire, their super objective, until the point where they realize, usually at the end of Act 2, they realize what they need to win the conflict or succeed in the film in whichever way. And it's often a radical and violent change that they undergo in their character development. If you remember episode 2 of series 1, I talk about the want versus the need and the lie that the character believes. And using the lie in your story is a fantastic way of adding conflict right off the bat, and you can develop it and resolve it in whichever way, and how the story ends and how the character grows or learns or changes and throughout their character development. And here's a couple of questions that you can ask your protagonist, usually in the second draft after you've written the story. When you go back to things and try to strengthen the story, you can ask your protagonist about these things, and almost like a checklist to see if you can improve a few things when incorporating the lie in that story. Now, generally, you'd think there's only one type of protagonist that writers use, and it depends on the genre or the story that shapes them. But in reality, there are actually different types of protagonists that you can find. And by knowing this knowledge, you can see how some of them can closely fit your unique story that you're writing, and you can help improve what you're busy doing. The first one, what we call, is a traditionalist or a classical protagonist. This is your typical everyday man or woman type of archetype, not your hero archetype. This is your round character that undergoes either a growth or a change or a decline arc in their forward momentum. This traditional protagonist is often seen as a morally good character. If you remember that alignment tool I discussed in episode 8 of series 1, first 6 alignments are often the protagonists. You have your lawfully good, your neutral good, your chaotic good, your true neutrals, your lawfully neutral or chaotic neutral. Those ones are often defined as a classical protagonist in how their morality is shaped. Their external world is often a reflection of their internal world, their internal conflict. And this type of protagonist is very human. They make difficult choices and decisions, and they often suffer the consequences if they make bad ones. And then lastly, the classical traditional protagonists are often by default setting the ego persona. If you remember the psychoanalysis film theory that I discussed previously in previous series, they often undertake that ego persona. Gangs of New York shows one of these traditional protagonists as the character experienced a wound with his death of his father as a young kid. After many years growing up, he returns to New York unknowing to anyone else, and he tries to establish himself as one of the butcher's right-hand man with the desire to take revenge on his father. But one of the story's biggest complication is that it's the midst of a civil war, and people are getting drafted, and there's a lot of chaos happening in the streets, and the protagonist eventually succeeds. He's super objective. And also note the antagonist is such a strong figure that he almost kills the protagonist as well. 12 Years a Slave shows one of these protagonists that experiences an unbelievable, extraordinary journey where we see this character as a free man in 1841, an African American that gets abducted and sold into slavery. The weeks turn into years as he fights for survival and struggles to get free of this madness until he crosses paths with a benevolent abolitionist that helps him, and after the horror of the 12 years, reunites with his family. Winter's Bone shows a beautiful type of classical protagonist that is tasked to keep up the household with her younger 2 siblings. She learns that her father put a bond on the house, and she sets out on a very dangerous journey to find her father, and there's a lot of risks. Her family is dependent on her, and she risks her life to try and find her father and learn the truth. Then you get the Protagonist-Antagonist. This is the manifestation of inner conflict in surreal form, where a protagonist realizes that their greatest adversary is actually themselves inside, and they struggle to overcome the external problem or the world problem without dealing with their inner conflict. And whether it's fear, phobia that cripples them, or self-doubt, or being overcritical, or being cynical, or even the bad types of obsessions that deteriorate their personalities and makes them suffer inside. Now, very interesting enough that this type of thing can be split into two, where the one that I just discussed, where the main character, the protagonist, is their own enemy, their own adversary, is themselves, and it's often a manifestation of their inner conflict. But that's the classical definition of what an antagonist are. The antagonist usually mirrors what the inner conflict is of your protagonist, whether it's a self-doubt or insecurities or whatever the thing is that the protagonist lacks, the antagonist have. But I'll discuss the antagonist in a later episode. But in the default setting is that it's a protagonist that is the antagonist themselves. The iconic Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is one of these examples where a scientist tries to create an experiment where he wants to separate good from evil by drinking a potion. But unfortunately, this experiment becomes uncontrollable as the character becomes more violent and ultimately brings a tragic end to both the downfall of Jekyll and Hyde, which is the same person. The Black Swan character beautifully shows this as well. She's driven by perfection to become New York's top ballerina. This obsession of perfection drives her into a psychological instability, where inner conflict or inner turmoil starts to blur the line between reality and fiction, or delusion in this case. This type of obsession is the bad type of obsession that can spiral the character into a pit of darkness. She symbolically is a manifestation of the play itself that the Black Swan is within her. A more complex thriller drama shown in Shutter Island that takes the audience on a journey following the two detectives, one being the protagonist, as the protagonist tries to investigate and discover the disappearance of a certain patient. But throughout the story, his partner reveals that he's essentially a psychiatrist, and that the main character, the protagonist, is a patient that is undergoing this repressed trauma, which was caused by ignoring when his wife was a manic depressive, in which she burned down their apartment. They moved to a lake house in which she drowned her kids. And when the character discovered this, he shot and killed his wife, and thus created the madness in which he lives. The very patient that the protagonist was searching for was himself. In this Freudian repression and regression, the character experienced both the protagonist and antagonist himself. Then you get the villainous protagonist, or what I like to call the immoral or amoral protagonist, because it has to do more with their morality than the villain archetype. So I often like to call these the amoral protagonist. These ones don't have empathy for others or treat other people well. They may even play the role of a good guy, of putting a mask on, and they can be like a serial killer. This type of protagonist often willingly will harm other people to get what they want, or a lust for power or status. They will crush everyone beneath them to elevate themselves. The typical narcissist would beautifully fit into this type of protagonist. They often undergo a rise and fall type of arc, or a decline arc. They see the world as their playground of some sort in a dog-eat-dog world ideology. And if we talk about the alignment tool again, they're often ones who fall into the bottom five, the true neutrals, the chaotic neutral, the lawfully evil, the neutral evil, or the chaotic evil. The Joker movie is a masterpiece type of case study of this amoral protagonist, in which we see a protagonist, not a Batman villain, but a protagonist, an amoral protagonist that experiences life, gets bullied, he gets isolated. No one laughs at his jokes. He's a failed comedian. He gets disregarded by society and the community. He has a conflict with his mother, and unknowingly stumbles into those delusions. And we see the character blossom himself in a downward spiral. Typically, a morally good protagonist would fight the obstacles moving up the staircase, but we see Arthur dance himself, entertains himself as he goes down the staircase into a spiral of madness and decline. The famous iconic Scarface movie beautifully show this type of amoral protagonist that chases the American dream through a violent and destructive path. He has a prime motivation to relentlessly and obsessively pursue wealth and power and status to escape the past that he experienced through poverty. He believes that money and power and status will bring him the respect that he craves, but his violent impulses and his paranoia isolates the character and prevents him from achieving the super objective. As for now, I will come back to the amoral protagonist in part 3. There's a lot of things that I need to talk to you about in writing an effective immoral protagonist. Then you get the famous 3 protagonists. That's the hero, the anti-hero, and the chosen one. These are 3 different types of protagonists that is very famous people use. The hero, often the ones who saves people, are very brave, are often leaders in that type of stories. And the anti-hero ones are often ones who refuse the call to adventure. They act in their own self-interest, their own nature. They're often neutral characters or lawfully neutral type of characters. Then the chosen one is often a predetermined type of protagonist that is destined to do something great, and they're the only one with the key to unlock the chamber, or the one to bring balance to the force. And usually this type of chosen one, they either try to figure out the prophecy, or they are the ones who destroy the prophecy. They often also undergo a hero's journey, much like the hero and the anti-hero. I will get back to these 3 because I've dedicated a full episode on the hero, the anti-hero, and the chosen one, as these are 3 archetypes that are famously used as a protagonist type. The next one is what we call a persona protagonist. This is generally your flat character, whereas the classical traditionalist is often a round character. The flat character is a persona protagonist, which means they resist change, they remain steadfast in their belief system. This type of protagonists are often found in the action genres, but they can be ones who firmly believe what they believe, and they solve the will problem, they solve their crisis with their skills that they already obtained. It's very important that the audience understand why this character resists change, or why this character endure the hardships and able to go on and fight the good fight. If you think about James Bond, that will often overcome the obstacles that's thrown in his path with his gadgets and tools and his wit. Or Indiana Jones, that is a flawed character in many sense, but remains that steadfast in his belief system, remains a flat character throughout the trilogy. Then you get the Maverick Protagonist. This type of protagonist is very skillful, very talentful, is very famous in what they've done in history, whether they are alive or already dead. They're ones who often have changed, and they resist complying to society, and usually the odd ones out, or the outcast, to change the norms, to change the thinking. They're the ones who excel in their leadership or their capability of making change. The goal of acceptance is a reaction to the culture that forces them to conform, and they're usually ones who are often very neutral in how they see themselves. They don't conform to anyone, whether it's good or bad. They do what they need to do, and the stakes are deeply meaningful and personal to these type of protagonists, and they often fall into the module B type of super objectives, where the situation and the circumstances determine the narrative of the story, because it's not often a grand heroic journey that they undertake. They are confined by the historical facts that made them famous in the first place. Then you get the diary protagonist. This is probably the most subjective form of writing, because you invite the audience into the main character's thoughts, and you have the protagonist narrate their own film. This is the narrator that's also the main character, the protagonist of the story, and they can often even break the fourth wall in the subtext of the story, like Woody Allen's character in Annie Hall, or Deadpool's character that knows more about the Marvel Universe than the characters inside the Marvel Universe. This diary protagonist may also have interactions with the voice of God narrator, main character that I spoke of in part 1. For example, Stranger Than Fiction, where Will Ferrell's character is literally speaking to the narrator. He's self-conscious or aware that someone is narrating his life, and he is in conflict with this voice of God. And the film Her, that shows this diary protagonist in a love relationship with this voice of God main character of the AI. Juno, the iconic teenage diary protagonist that experienced a teenage pregnancy, and the film was very famous for her witty dialogue in narration and how she interacts with the other characters, especially the boyfriend that's also a teenager. Both of them experiences a coming of age, fish out of water type of genre. In the post-apocalyptic zombie infested world of Zombieland, we have a beautiful example of a diary protagonist as he narrates his journey with the audience, trying to stay alive and survival according to a very strict set of rules. Then you get the Duel Protagonist. This is often a complex story where you got two protagonists telling two different stories, and both of them are proactively moving the story forward in their spiraling, interconnecting, clashing, multi-plot type of structure that you're telling, but both of them are being proactive, trying to obtain their super objectives, and they're often confined by a central theme. The general rule of thumb is that you should always create one protagonist that the audience can focus on that specific story. But in the case of two protagonists, just make sure that you balance the story equally in how you show them proactively moving the story forward, and whether it's opposing forces or characters that are aligned together towards the same goal. Usually the buddy cop genre beautifully shows this with two protagonists, often cops, trying to stop the bad guys. The iconic Prestige show this beautiful dual protagonists, each with their own super objective, trying to be the best magician in London. Their fierce rivalry and competition to be the best magician is engulfed with their obsession to try to invent new things and try to amaze the audience regardless of the risks and the stakes involved. The stakes get higher and higher. You may argue that the one is a protagonist and the one is an antagonist, but in many cases when you watch this film, they both pursue the super objective obsessively that is in line, that builds the narrative of the story. Martin Scorsese's The Departed also beautifully shows these two dual protagonists, each with their unique super objective. Both are trying to find out information about each either side. They're both living a double life as a double agent. The one as a criminal in the law enforcement and the other one as an undercover cop. And both of them race to uncover the mole to save their own lives. The only danger with this type of story is that when you have two protagonists, the audience may find some confusion who the story is about or which perspective am I following. Is this the main character protagonist, or is this the main character separate from the protagonist, or is this the antagonist and this the protagonist? There can be some confusion with this type of story. It's important to equally weigh these stories, and hopefully at the end of the film or the last act, you reveal the grand scheme of things or the themes that reveal why this is done, whether those opposing stories have some sort of connection, or it's a dual protagonists that are both pursuing or moving the plot forward towards the same super objective. Then you get the switching protagonist. That's often a culmination of any of the other tropes just mentioned, whether it's classical or immoral or Maverick or Persona or whatever. What happens in this specific instance is that a lot of attention, screen time, and point of view is given to a main character protagonist that moves the story forward, but something happens to them, usually in the inciting incident or even in the first 10% or inciting incident or the midpoint, that another character, another protagonist takes over and finalizes, finishes the story. Famously shown in Psycho, where we show the protagonist main character that moves the story forward until the Bates Motel, and only after she gets murdered, the perspective switches from the main character protagonist to the immoral protagonist that murders her and moves the story forward into completion. whichever protagonist type that you're dealing with, the switching protagonist is the story device that you build in, knowing that the main character protagonist that you start off with, that you will kill them. And the one taking over, it's either an alternative perspective or it's a complementary perspective that finishes the story. 1917 beautifully shows these two protagonists that's tasked to deliver an urgent message to the front lines, which means they need to cross multiple very hazardous and dangerous land to get to the front lines. Unfortunately, the main protagonist gets killed, and his friend essentially adopts the new protagonist role, and he goes above and beyond to reach the front lines. The urgency is so crucial that he makes a choice to go over the top and run directly straight to the officers in charge and delivers the message, even if it's after the time. But the officer reluctantly calls back the charging order, and the protagonist is successful. The Place Beyond the Pines is a beautiful example of this, where the protagonist bungles up a bank robbery. He takes shelter in a house, and the cops show up. They have a shootout. The cop shoots the protagonist dead, and the protagonist shoots the cop in the leg, and the story shifts focus to the cop continuing on the story. Then you get the special protagonists that are often confined or classified by their mental disabilities or physical disabilities that restrict them or add additional conflict or obstacles in their forward momentum. The ones who are either deaf or blind or unable to move, or your autism or your ADD or multiple personality syndrome, those type of protagonists will fall under this category. The extreme versions can be like Ace Ventura being clearly clinical, mentally insane. Then lastly, you get the protagonist that is separated from the main character, like I've discussed in part 1. You'll do exactly the same stuff normally for protagonists moving the story forward. They are 100% involved in the conflict. They're usually the ones who resolve the conflict, whereas the main character, the story is about the main character observing this protagonist. For example, if you think about Napoleon Dynamite, the main character is Napoleon Dynamite, but the protagonist in the story is his friend that he helps trying to get elected, and his friend actually fails his quest because he's not very popular. Napoleon Dynamite jumping in to save the day to help the protagonist achieve what he set out to achieve. Famously shown in The Dark Knight, when the main character is Batman and the protagonist is Harvey Dent, and we see the story through Batman's eyes as he and Gordon tries to get Harvey Dent elected to help the city. But unfortunately, the Joker is the complication in that story and turns Harvey Dent obviously against Batman. And at the end, Batman takes the fall to ensure the legacy of Harvey Dent, to instill that hope in the citizens. In conclusion, I hope this all makes sense. The ones I've shown here are just maybe a handful. Maybe there are 10 different ones that I've left out throughout cinema history. Maybe you can spot them and analyze them yourself. But just to give you an idea that there's various types of protagonists that exist, not just one. And obviously don't go and force these things onto your own story. If you're creating something special, something unique, designing your own protagonist that may not fit any of these, don't force anything. If you find that I've specifically mentioned something that you're busy writing, do the research, watch those movies, try to put a few keywords in Google, try to find those movies and watch them and try to learn from those characters. Maybe you can elevate and improve your own character just by understanding the protagonist that you're writing. In the next episode, I'll be exploring some writing tips for your protagonist and how to create an effective protagonist for your stories. Let's continue the conversation in part 3. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode.